Hey everybody, what's happening? Today I've got a really interesting topic on the chopping block. We're going to talk about simulation theory, and we're going to actually talk about what it means to Christianity and what it implies about the Trinity. So I have three very brief warnings. Okay, warning number one, we're going to get nerdy today. This is going to be a nerdy topic. And so apologies in advance. I'm going to try to explain everything in a way that's accessible to a wide range of audiences. Warning number two, nothing that I say in this video should be taken as an absolute fact. So these are things that are interesting lines of evidence to look at, and I think that they point in an interesting direction. Okay, that doesn't necessarily mean that I think the evidence that I'm presenting is conclusive for anything. But I think if you take it at face value and you take it in a neutral way, it may lead you to thinking in new ways about the universe. And if you're Christian, I think this might even lead you to thinking new ways about Christianity. I hope that some of the ideas are at least very interesting to think about. I think they're really interesting. All right, warning number three. We are a very new channel, so we really appreciate your support. If you want to like this video, that's really wonderful. If you subscribe to the channel, we love that. If you click the bell icon for notifications, that helps make sure that you don't miss out on any future videos. And the number one thing that I would love for you to do for us is comment on this video, because I want to know what your thoughts are. I want to carry the discussion on with you all included in that discussion. And believe it or not, when you guys comment and you say something that I don't agree with, 9 times out of 10, I actually learn a lot from what you all say. All right, so this is going to be a fun topic today. All right, so what is simulation theory? So first, we have to sort of say what is an authentic reality versus a simulated reality. And we're going to basically use those terms as antonyms of each other, of opposites, right? So a simulated reality is a reality that is not sort of genuine or authentic. An authentic reality, there's a lot of different terms for it. You can call it the organic reality, the authentic reality, the reality of the real world, or you can call it, the natural reality or an analog reality. But that's different than the simulated reality. All right, so now what is a simulated reality? There are a lot of different analogies for coming up with a simulated reality. You know, every night when you dream, really, you create a simulated reality. Your mind is coming up with a simulation, scenarios, a world that doesn't exist, and then your mind puts you in that world. Have you ever had a dream where you can figure out that that dream isn't the real world, it's not authentic reality, and you figure that out by sort of testing the limits of reality and seeing how the laws of reality work? I mean, they kind of talk about this in Inception, but a lot of people who dream lucidly can sort of get there with their own logic. They can just sort of be in the dream and say, oh, I actually can figure out that this is a dream. So that's a way of like saying, are we in authentic reality or are we in the simulated reality of the dream? There's other ways to think of analogies for simulated reality, like the Matrix, right? When Neo and all his friends go into the Matrix, they are inside a simulated reality that's being created by a computer mind. That's not the authentic reality. That's not the real world, in other words. And there's one more analogy that I'll make just to help explain the difference between a simulated reality and an authentic reality with a little more clarity. And this analogy will actually become quite relevant just down the line. So I think it's an important one. And that's the analogy of video games. So imagine that you're playing Mario Kart, and you're playing Mario Kart on like a super souped up Nintendo, 80,000, like a really high-end computer, okay? And imagine that in this game of Mario Kart, you're fighting against, Bowser, right? And what we've done in this game is Bowser, who's an NPC, a non-playable character, we've endowed him with some agency. It means he can make decisions, he can sort of strategize, he can work against us. That might make the game more fun. Now, let's turn his agency or his ability to act in this simulated reality up to like 1,000 and maybe even up to 1,000,000. Now, he might even start being able to look around at his universe, and he might see things that don't make sense. Like, for example, let's say he runs over a mushroom and he increases in size. That's like one of the rules of the game. Well, he might say to himself, why is it that this mushroom makes me get much larger in size? He might even, if he's very, very clever, if he's programmed to be extremely clever, become sort of self-aware and say, wait a second, this mushroom is violating the laws of physics of our reality, And the only explanation for that is that this reality is not authentic. All right, so this video game analogy will come to relevance even to an even greater degree later down the road in this video. But basically, hopefully, these three analogies give you a set of comparisons for the difference between authentic reality and simulated reality. All right, part 2 of this little talk. What is the evidence that our reality is actually a simulation? Well, very interestingly, there are a lot of pieces of evidence that point to the idea that our reality, what we perceive as authentic or real experience around us, the real universe or the real cosmos, may actually be a simulation. What are those signs? There's a few of them. So number one, some people say that fine-tuning is evidence of somebody monkeying around with a program that runs the universe. In fact, I think that was actually argued by Fred Hoyle. Fred Hoyle was himself an atheist, but he thought that fine-tuning was an interesting argument for the existence of God, and he came up with that phrase of monkeying around. You may recognize the name Fred Hoyle because he's also the same physicist that came up with the name for black holes. Really brilliant scientist, by the way. All right, what's another example? All right, imagine that you're playing a video game and you get really close up to the screen and you look at the pixels that are rendering the video game, the little pixels on the screen. You'll start realizing that those pixels aren't like inherent properties of, they don't look the same as you get really close. In other words, let's say there's a video game, there's a tree in the video game, and you get your face right up to the screen, and now the tree all of a sudden starts to look like it's made of pixels. And when you're looking at those pixels very closely, they don't look like a tree anymore, and they behave quite differently. Well, that's kind of the same thing that we see when we look at reality at a very, very small scale. Quantum reality has some properties that are very like pixelation. In fact, the word quantum means like stair-stepping. So that scale of reality, quantum reality, has some features that look a lot like pixelation. And then if you get even smaller down to the Planck scale, the Planck scale is named after Max Planck, you get to a scale where reality, time, space, loses all meaning and all context. And so that's a scale where we're looking so small at the pieces that make up the universe that the universe starts to look very pixelated. It no longer looks like our authentic reality. So that's maybe a sign that we're peering very closely down into a very small scale that might reveal that there's this sort of pixelation that happens in our reality. Another argument why the universe might be a simulation is the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. So, when you're not doing something in a virtual reality video game, there's sort of nothing happening in that part of your field of view. And then imagine that you sort of turn your head and you look elsewhere in the field of view. What happens to those pixels? They start rendering because, the computer system might know that you're looking in that direction. If you're not looking in that direction, nothing's really rendered. Well, that's a really great analogy for Young's slit experiment, which is, this idea of quantum mechanics about wave-particle duality. And just to give this in a more clear way, so I don't get too nerdy with my explanations, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle basically, and I'm oversimplifying this argument a little bit, but the Heisenberg uncertainty principle basically says that when you look down at a quantum scale, particles seem to have behaviors where they're not quite determinate, right? So they're like waves and particles at the same time. They have probability distributions. And if you look at a photon on that scale, it looks like a wave, and it doesn't really become a discrete packet. It doesn't really become information or a point until you look at it and you observe it. And once you observe it, it tends to solidify. That sounds a lot like a computer program that renders reality depending on whether or not it's being observed. So that's another interesting idea. Another interesting idea is the speed of light. The speed of light can be thought of as sort of a rendering speed. When you're moving at the speed of light through space, what you create is a cone of information, and sort of you create an observable future in your cone of information. So there is sort of a maximal rendering speed that you have. In other words, you can't just fly through the universe at a maximal speed. The laws of reality seem to prevent that. So the speed of light sort of acts like a rendering speed would act in a computer system that's running. So that's another way that the universe kind of looks like a simulation in some ways. One other interesting argument, and there's actually a couple more on my list, but one other interesting argument is Nick Bostrom's argument, which is a trilemma. Now, Nick Bostrom said something really interesting, which is, if we had the capacity to create a simulated reality that would be extremely lifelike, maybe even as lifelike as our own experience, wouldn't we do it? So his point is that if that's the case, and if it seems likely that we're able to create universes or simulated universes, we can create simulated video games after all, that get marginally, incrementally closer to our own reality, then it's not too hard to imagine that at some point in the future, we will be able to create a simulation that is indistinguishable from our reality. Now, what Nick Bostrom says is that if that's the case, then it becomes increasingly likely that there would be more simulated realities in existence than authentic realities. For instance, imagine for a moment that our life, our universe, is a computer game that's being created by an alien species that's really vastly more intelligent than we are. By all likelihood, they probably have created a lot of different universes. With each universe they create, it makes it more likely that the authentic reality is just one of many universes, and it starts looking like more and more of those universes are simulated. So that's Nick Bostrom's argument. There's another really great argument from Max Tegmark, which is that the universe is fundamentally mathematical. I'm not going to go super in detail on this because it's quite esoteric, and I don't want to lose too many people. But imagine if the universe is fundamentally mathematical. What would that look like? Well, it would look like a computer program that's running, and the universe would be based on that computer program. So that's an interesting idea too. All right, and the last argument that I'm going to make, because it does become relevant later as well, is this analogy that the universe works like a hologram. Now, I'm going to really oversimplify this a lot, and I apologize, but Leonard Susskind and Gerard de Tooft did this great solution to this information loss paradox of what happens in a black hole. It was a decades-long debate, actually, between Leonard Susskind's camp and Stephen Hawking's camp about what happens in a black hole. And what they realized is that the event horizon of the black hole looks like a matrix of information. So essentially, if you take something and you squish it down to the size of a black hole, you will leave an imprint of two-dimensional information that is just as real as the information that you've squished down. Now, I'm going to explain this in a different way because I know that that probably sounds very esoteric, but I can explain it in a much more simpler way. Imagine if you squish down the Earth into a tiny, tiny point the size of about a small coin, okay? Well, what you would create is you'd create a black hole. It's nearly impossible to do this with mass like the Earth, but just imagine that you did it. So if now, according to Leonard Susskind and Gerard de Tooft, you can't lose any information in this process. So the universe has this fundamental law where information is always conserved. So just like matter and energy, information cannot be lost. Now that means that if you looked at the event horizon of this black hole that you created, it should contain all the information that was originally on the Earth. Now, that's actually very interesting because you would think that the information that a black hole would hold would be proportional to its volume because it is, after all, a sphere. But Leonard Susskind and Gerard de Tooft say no, it's actually the event horizon, which is a two-dimensional surface. So that means that everything on the Earth can be expressed on this two-dimensional surface. Now, does this prove that the universe is a simulation if the universe works like a hologram? No, it does not. But it points us in an interesting direction. So again, what this argument says is that you can experience the universe in two different ways. One is to live inside the three-dimensional information of the universe, and the other one is to live outside the universe and look at that two-dimensional matrix of information. And that information that you're reading is just as authentic, just as real as the three-dimensional experience within the universe. I know that's a little bit of a complex idea. That may be something that I have to clarify again in a further video down the road, but I think it's an interesting idea and it becomes important later on. All right, now what does this mean for the existence of God? So we're going to first talk about what a simulated reality means for the existence of God, and then we're going to talk about what a simulated reality might mean for Christianity. All right, so interestingly, and again, I'm not saying this is definitive, but interestingly, if you think of the universe as simulated, this sort of points to the existence of God for three different, I think, very interesting reasons. Not definitive, but I think it leads us in an interesting direction. Okay, so first of all, what we've said is if you look at the universe, basically you can sum up the universe not by looking at the three-dimensional volume of the universe, but by looking at the universe as the event horizon, which is the sphere that surrounds the cosmos. Now, this is interesting because we're saying that the universe works like a matrix of information. It's basically like a sheet of zeros and ones, essentially. Now, every time we find information in nature, there is always some sort of cognitive process that absorbs that information. So there's always some counterpart whenever there's information in nature that is taking that information in. Like if there's a flower that has a color on it, there's a bee that sort of has to match that color. If you look at birds, birds like the male birds have very colorful plumages of their feathers. And that happens for specific evolutionary reasons. So anytime we find information in the universe, we seem to find a sort of cognitive awareness of that information. So that's kind of an interesting idea. Okay, reason number 2 why this sort of points towards the existence of God is because the universe is totalitarianistic. Now, what do we mean by this? I don't mean totalitarian as in an authoritarian regime. What I mean instead is the universe is totalitarian to the extent that everything that can happen in the universe seems to be compulsory to happen. In fact, that's how we worked out a lot of how the Standard Model works. What we said is, what are all the particles that can possibly exist? And then we started realizing that every possible combination of subatomic particles is a combination of subatomic particles that needs to exist. So everything that's a possibility eventually becomes compulsory. So what this analogy shows us is that if there is information on the event horizon of the universe, then it's possible to be aware of that information. And if everything that can happen must happen, then that sort of points us a little closer to the direction of a cognitive awareness being able to take in this information, right? Because we're saying it's possible to observe all the information in the universe. It's possible to be aware of that information. That suggests that if there's possibility of an awareness, that awareness must come into existence. If the universe and whatever exists beyond our universe is totalitarian, that's a very, very interesting idea. All right, and the third reason why a simulated reality points to the existence of God is it goes back to Nick Bostrom's argument. So Nick Bostrom says that it becomes increasingly likely if civilizations can continue to advance, that it becomes increasingly likely that they'll create a simulated reality. And therefore, just mathematically over time, there will be more simulated realities than authentic realities, which again, there should only be one authentic reality. Now, this is an interesting argument. You can apply it to our universe, right? You can say, like, well, we're likely to create simulated universes, and there's maybe an alien species that created our universe, so that makes it more likely that there would be simulated realities rather than authentic realities. But here's what's interesting. That argument applies to the reality that the aliens themselves are in, right? So in other words, those aliens ought to look at their universe for the same reasons that Nick Bostrom articulates and say, hey, wait, our universe is probably also a simulation, right? And so their universe ought to be also a simulation, right? So there must be a universe beyond their universe that is the authentic reality that simulated their universe. Now you see where the problem starts coming in, is you have this sort of infinite regression where you have simulated universes within simulated universes created by other simulated universes created by other simulated universes. So that creates a problem here because basically nothing can come into existence, right? There has to be some authentic reality. So a very, very clean reconciliation of this problem of infinite regression, if you start talking about simulated universes, is that there is one programmer who created a simulated universe, and beyond the universe, there is only that programmer, and that's the authentic reality. Now, this model starts to look a lot like God. So those are three different arguments. There's also a much simpler way of sort of distilling all these arguments down, with which you could just say, well, if our reality is simulated, then it's likely programmed, and therefore that reality has a programmer. But I think this argument is so interesting that it merits going a little deeper. All right, now let's get to the final part of this video where we're going to talk about simulated reality and what that means for Christianity and the Trinity. And I think this is where we get to some ideas that you may not have previously considered. All right, so number one, imagine if humans could create a simulated reality. Wouldn't we at least once incarnate into that simulation? Imagine there's a programmer who creates a simulated reality. He creates all these conscious simulated beings. Wouldn't it sort of be intuitively obvious that at some point that programmer would enter into the program and sort of interact with his creations, I feel like that's his or her creations, I should say. I feel like that's sort of an intuitively just an idea that makes a lot of sense. Now we have sort of the idea of a programmer who incarnates into the program. Now, this sounds a lot to me like the incarnation of Jesus. And again, I don't tend to get very high in my Christology or my theology in any of these talks that I've done or any of these videos, but I think that's a very interesting idea. If you look at the statements of Jesus, they seem to very specifically indicate, and I'll put some statements on the screen, but they seem to very specifically indicate over and over again, iteratively, that our reality is not the real, authentic reality, that there is a kingdom beyond this world. I feel like Jesus is sort of communicating a message that sounds a lot like the programmer would be communicating if he created a simulated program. So I feel like a lot of Jesus' messages are like, this is not the ultimate reality. This is not the end stage of reality. There is a universe beyond this existence. It's almost as though he's saying, like, I program this world, you are in it, you're living this way, and you can do things that make you feel like you're accumulating points in this world. But remember, the points that you accumulate in this world, like in terms of wealth, don't really matter that much to me. And the reason why they don't matter is because there is a realm beyond this realm. So we might feel like we're playing a video game, we're gaining a lot of points by gaining wealth inside the video game. But I think the point that Jesus makes, which is compelling in regards to simulation theory, is that this is not the ultimate universe. I think that's an interesting idea, and some of the statements of Jesus take on a much deeper poignancy if you consider the analogy of this universe being simulated. All right, there's one other interesting point that I think Jesus makes that I think is very interesting, which is I feel like Jesus, especially in the Gospel of John, gives us a command to learn things about the universe. Do you remember when Jesus says, I think at some point, and I'll put it on the screen, you are no longer my servants, you are now my friends. And what is that line where we transition from being servants to friends? That line is knowledge, right? He said, you now know your master's business. You know my plans. You know what, you've learned something, and therefore you've made that transition. Now, this is interesting because that means that to deepen friendship, to deepen knowledge, understanding, and deepen our relational experience with Jesus or God, we have to gain more knowledge. So that gives rise to a lot of statements in the Bible that were really brilliantly interpreted by Thomas Aquinas that says that love and knowledge are sort of conjoined actions. In other words, you can't really love something without knowing it very deeply, and you can't really know something without loving it. So this is interesting. It has a lot of application to human relationships, with our relationships with each other. We tend to love people the most deeply if we know them the best. And as we get to know somebody, that really sort of engenders a type of closeness with them. So I think this is interesting. I think it's an interesting argument that Jesus makes particularly in the Gospel of John, but also elsewhere. And then, Jesus really seems to be prescribing that your practice of religion should change. I feel like a lot of what Jesus is saying, I no longer want you to be servants. I want you to be friends. I want our relationship to be relational. Now, if you look at Judaism, they revere God in a very distantly reverent way. For instance, like when they read the Old Testament, they use this metallic wand named a yad. I think it's called a yad, Y-A-D. I'm probably mispronouncing that. And that's because the Old Testament is so holy to them that they can't even touch it. So, I feel like there's sort of a difference in the New Testament where Jesus says, okay, you've been servants. Now I want you to be friends. Now I want you to learn more about me. And it's almost as though there's this implicit commandment we should learn about God. And how do we best learn about God? Well, I would argue that we learn about God by pursuing cosmology, studying physics, by learning more about mathematics, and a lot of people have echoed this throughout time. Gottfried Leibniz, who invented calculus, is somebody who's famous for saying, things about by studying mathematics, he's essentially studying the language of the universe and getting to know God more deeply. I think these ideas are all very interesting, but I also think that they all really gain a significant poignancy if you consider our reality as a simulated reality and the reality beyond our reality as the authentic reality. Now, this also we're going to switch gears a little bit and just close with talking about the relation between simulation theory and the Trinity itself. So if we're talking about an authentic universe beyond our reality, a real universe, and then our own simulated reality or simulated universe, then, we're talking about, essentially an intra-universal presence of God and an extra universal presence of God. Now, this sounds like, to me, this sounds a little bit like the conceptualization of God as God the Father, the external God outside of the universe. I prefer to say, let's say just God, and the Holy Spirit, which is the God's presence inside the universe. So I think this is very interesting because you have sort of a bifurcated God, and those comprise two components of the Trinity. The third portion of the Trinity, Jesus, also makes sense within simulation theory, as we've also said. Let me close this out with just one other way to analogize the way God would work in a simulated universe with the Trinity. And that analogy is like, let's say that that the world, the planet Earth, is the whole of reality, including our simulated reality and the rest of reality. So the way we're going to create this analogy is we're going to say, imagine that you're living on planet Earth and you've created the oceans and fishes in the ocean. So what are the three ways that you could experience the ocean? Well, number one, you could be the ocean itself. You could be the water, and that would be one way of sort of experiencing the ocean and knowing everything that there is to know about the ocean. And that's sort of analogous in some ways to the Holy Spirit. Another way is you could sort of hold the earth in your hand and look at the ocean and look at its borders and understand the ocean from an external perspective. And that's sort of the way that I think of like the extra universal God is, or what we were calling God for this video. So I think there's a very interesting analogy. And then of course there's the third way to understand the ocean, which is to live in the biosphere of the ocean as a fish. And that sort of makes sense with Jesus. So I think that simulation theory has a lot of very interesting poignancy and resonance with the Trinity. All right, with that, I'm going to close this video. I really wanted to keep this video under 30 minutes because a few of my videos have been kind of long, and I realize that makes things quite difficult. But we've talked a lot about a lot of interesting ideas. I'll just close out by saying, don't forget, if we're a new channel, feel free to like this video. I would love it if you subscribe to the channel. We'd love to get more subscribers. If you want to make sure that you don't miss any future videos, click the bell icon for notifications. And then the most important thing that you can do, which helps me a lot intellectually and personally, is comment on this video. Let me know what your thoughts are. Let me know what you think about this idea of a simulated universe. Have you encountered this before? I'd love to keep the conversation going. Even if you're saying something that you think I am likely to disagree with, I promise you, a lot of times your comments have really changed my mind about a lot of different thoughts. Okay, well, thanks so much for tuning in. I will make sure that I include in the description for this video a lot of helpful resources because I know we've touched on some very, very complicated topics. But I'll put some resources in the video link. At least one of these resources is a paper that is in my field of expertise. So that's one reason why I really like making this video. I get to talk about something that I've actually published papers about. So I've published about 50 peer-reviewed papers. Most of my videos have been in the realm of textual criticism or historical scholarship. This video is about something that I've actually published on. So I'm excited about that. And I really would love to know what you think about this video. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in. It's been really wonderful to talk to you about this very fascinating topic. One of the most fascinating things I think we've talked about on this channel so far. So thank you very, very much for your support. And as always, please have a really, really wonderful day.